Welcome everyone to our March 2022 Civic Awareness Series. My name is Will. I'll be one of your co-hosts tonight. We are glad you're here tonight to talk about ranked choice voting with Mayor Daniel Biss. Before I go too far, I do want to know that this program is sponsored by the League of Women Voters of Central King County, the League of Women Voters of Wheaton, and the McCormick House at Cantigny Park. If you're new to our program, new to the Civic Awareness Series, this type of program where we talk about civic issues, both local and national, align with the mission of the McCormick House. You may or may not know that Cantigny Park was once the residence of the editor and publisher of the Great Chicago Tribune, the world's greatest newspaper. And not only was Mr. McCormick a very smart, very shrewd businessman, he cared very deeply and very passionately about civics, citizenship, voting. Certainly this topic that we're talking about tonight would be something that Colonel McCormick would encourage all of us to know more about. And that carries on the mission of what we do at the House to try to engage people with civic issues. So this program fits perfectly with the mission of Cantigny, and it also dovetails nicely with the McCormick Foundation that sponsors Cantigny Park and was started at Colonel McCormick's death. My position here at Cantigny is Director of Museums at Cantigny Park, but my heart is in the McCormick House. And you may or may not know as well that the house itself is closed for renovation. About a year and a half, it'll be closed. Major renovation, the mechanical systems need to be replaced, plumbing, electrical, you name it. We had to make the entire building more ADA accessible. We're very close to having that project done and that construction done. We hope to welcome you all back into the museum at least by Thanksgiving. And we look forward to having this type of program in the building again. Again, I want to say a few more things if I could. I want to give you a briefing about some of the technical aspects of our program. This presentation will last about an hour. Tonight's event is being recorded. All attendees here, registrants, have been muted and your cameras have been turned off. We encourage you to ask questions. You're going to see below on the lower portion of your screen a Q&A button. We encourage you to ask questions during the presentation. The questions will be addressed towards the end of the program. And also that closed caption, you're probably seeing it right now on your screens. Great feature we've got with this new Zoom. But if you don't want Zoom, you can mute it. Or if you want to turn it back on, you can do that. And you can adjust the size of the font. So you want to make it bigger or smaller. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Pamela and we'll go from there.
Thank you, Will. And thanks to everyone who's joining us this evening to this March Civic Awareness Program. I'm Pam Zimmerman from the Wheaton League, and I'll be your moderator this evening for our topic, ranked choice voting. What is it and why cities and states are adopting this particular electoral method? So as Will mentioned, we're going to go for about an hour. Our presenter will present some information, and then you can put your questions, as Will mentioned, in the Q&A. I'll monitor those and we'll ask as many of those as we can toward the end of our program. We are very pleased this evening to have as our speaker tonight, Daniel Biss. Daniel is the mayor of Evanston, Illinois. He began his career as a mathematics professor at the University of Chicago before becoming an organizer, and then as an elected official, he has served as a member of the Illinois House and the Illinois Senate, and ran an insurgent grassroots campaign for the Democratic nomination for governor, you may remember, coming in second in a very crowded field. His campaigns and public service have all featured a strong commitment to public engagement, to political reform and economic justice, So it is my pleasure on behalf of the League of Women Voters and the McCormick Foundation to welcome Mayor Daniel Biss this evening.
Thank you so much, Pam. Thank you to the various leagues who came together to put this on. I'm really appreciative of a chance to talk about ranked choice voting, which I think is a very meaningful reform that could make a big difference and that also puts most people to sleep. And so the enthusiasm and the turnout here to talk about this issue, I think, is really a real testament because, you know, I've had difficulty getting people engaged in talking about this topic, but once they begin to participate in the conversation, there's a tremendous opportunity to really, I think, make significant changes that would make a big difference in our state in particular. Also want to thank Will and Chris in particular, but Cantini Park in general. I'm, you know, obviously nobody likes another Zoom evening, and I'm of course sad that we can't be together in person, but especially just given both the beautiful space that is Cantini, and also given the really fond memories I have of a number of different times I've had the chance to be with many of you there. I'm just I'm sad we can't be together, but really appreciative that we do have this opportunity to speak. So what I'm going to do is I want to talk for a bit, but you know, because we have you know, an hour, or at least until most of the hour, until 8 o'clock, and because this honestly can be kind of a, you know, a technical or dry topic, I want to just give a kind of overview of what ranked choice voting is, how it works, and why, as the title suggests, why a lot of communities are toying with it or even adopting it. And then we can open it up for conversation. I think this is a fun issue to grapple with together and to really talk through collectively. But the example that I always lean on first in thinking about ranked choice voting is an example that was a little bit traumatic for people from my political party, which is the example of the 2000 presidential election. So famously, it was an incredibly close election in Florida between George W. Bush and Al Gore. Florida was going to be the decisive state. Ultimately, Bush won after complicated legal maneuverings that a lot of people have a lot of different feelings about. But ultimately, in the certified results, Bush won by 537 votes out of, you know, something like 6 million cast, let's say, 537. Well, what was interesting is that Ralph Nader got almost 100,000 votes. So the difference between the two candidates is 537, and yet there's 100,000 votes nearly, so almost 200 times as many that are cast for Ralph Nader. And most people would figure, well, listen, you know, George W. Bush is the Republican, the more conservative candidate. Al Gore is the Democrat, the more liberal candidate. And Ralph Nader was the Green Party candidate, thought of, I think, by most people as significantly further to the left of Al Gore. And so people figured, listen, yeah, those 100,000 folks voted for Ralph Nader. That was their choice. That was their preference. Good on them. They did what they believed in. But, you know, if they had been called upon to choose between Al Gore and George W. Bush, they probably would have chosen Al Gore, most of them at least. And that's 100,000 people, most of whom would have voted for Al Gore, who only lost by 537 votes. Wait a second. Was the outcome really fair? I'm not saying was the outcome legal. The outcome was legal. The rule is whoever gets the most wins. But the goal of an election isn't just to do some arithmetic problem. The goal is to figure out how to build a government that reflects what the people want. And if Gore and Bush were essentially tied, but there's another 100,000 extra people who prefer Gore to Bush, isn't Gore a better reflection of the preference of the people of Florida than Bush? And so that's where ranked choice voting comes in. And a ranked choice voting system probably would have changed the outcome of that election. A ranked choice voting system, on the front end, I will confess, it asks a little bit more of the voter. In that election, it does not ask you to go in and just pick a name. Pick your Gore or your Bush or your Nader or your Buchanan or your fringe candidate who no one 22 years later has any recollection of, and check a single box and walk out of the polling place and call it a day. Ranked choice voting asks you to do something a little more complicated. It asks you to rank the candidates. So let's say you're a you're a Nader person who, prefers Gore to Bush, you would say, hey, my first choice is Nader, but my second choice is Gore, and my third choice is Bush. So everybody has the opportunity not only to pick their top choice, but to say who their second choice is and to say who their third choice is. And, depending on how many candidates there are, to say who their fourth and fifth and sixth and so forth choice is. And then when it comes time to count the votes, first thing you do is you say, well, how many votes did everybody get? How many people chose, let's say, Al Gore as their top choice? How many people chose George W. Bush as their top choice? How many people chose Ralph Nader as their top choice? And if somebody has the support of a majority of the electorate, they're the winner and you call it a day. But if nobody has a support of the majority, if somebody's got 40% and somebody else has 40% and somebody else has 20%, let's say, then instead of saying whoever happened to get the most votes wins and we're done, instead you say, hey, listen, whoever came in last gets eliminated and their votes get redistributed. So in this example, if the outcome was Bush came in first but had less than half of the votes and Gore came in second and then Nader came in last, you would say, well, listen, Nader's out. He's not it. He lost. And now that he's no longer in the picture, we can redistribute the votes of the folks who voted for him first, and their second choice votes now count. And in that situation, practically speaking, probably most of the folks who voted for Nader, their second choice would have been Gore, and Gore would have then on the second tally gotten a whole bunch of extra votes and probably then had the majority and been declared the victor. So it's a much more complicated sounding way of tabulating the results based upon the much more complicated thing we ask the electorate to do, which is rank the candidates instead of just pick one. But then when you're done, at the end of the day, what you've found is not just the candidate who happens to have the most votes, but you found the candidate who does the best job of getting the majority of the voters to be aligned with them. Not necessarily the majority said, you're my choice, but the majority said, I like you better than the other options in front of me. Now I want to stress, and I'm a partisan Democrat and happy to, in other contexts, defend that vociferously, but I want to stress that though this example is one where having a ranked choice voting system would have turned out well for Democrats, I think there's really nothing partisan about this discussion whatsoever. I'll give you another example. Think back to 10 years later, 2010, the gubernatorial election here in Illinois. In that year, Pat Quinn had, he'd recently been elevated to the office of governor because of Rod Blagojevich's impeachment, and he was now running for a full term. Truth be told is he wasn't all that popular. His Republican opponent was a guy by the name of Bill Brady, who had, let's just say he was a very conservative Republican. He was not a moderate Republican. He was not even a sort of pretty far right, center right Republican. He was kind of the most conservative of the options. And so a lot of voters went to the polls that year and said, I don't know. I can't be for Pat Quinn. He's incumbent. I don't like him. And I don't, my dissatisfaction with his performance renders me simply unwilling to vote for him for re-election. But I don't know about this Brady guy. He seems pretty far right. And there was a third candidate, kind of a protest vote candidate, a guy by the name of Scott Lee Cohen. And Scott Lee Cohen did incredibly well. And if you looked at the precinct returns, it looked like he did especially well in places where Pat Quinn wasn't popular, but places where a truly far right Republican wouldn't have gone over well. In other words, for the folks who went to the polls knowing they weren't for Pat Quinn, but not really loving the idea of voting for Bill Brady either, there was another option, Scott Lee Cohen, and they could vote for Cohen. But if they had the opportunity to write down their second choice, voters like that would have almost certainly marked Bill Brady as their second choice over Pat Quinn, because they again felt that the incumbent office holder simply had not earned that full term. And so in the outcome, as you remember, Quinn won that race very, very narrowly, but with well under 50% of the vote. And a big chunk of votes went to other candidates. And based on all the research I've seen, had there been a ranked choice system, had the voters who selected those other candidates been given the opportunity to mark a second choice and then had their votes redistributed, Quinn almost certainly would have lost that election. And that's an outcome that I, as a Democrat, would have been very, very despondent about. Certainly, I'm not saying that I think that would have been the right outcome for the state of Illinois on a policy level based on my own views and my own ideological commitments. But I think, again, a system that selects someone not just based on their ability to get more votes than anybody else, whether that gets you 75% or 25%, but rather based on their ability to hold together a majority, is a system that ultimately allows for more effective governance that's more consistent with the preferences of the majority of population. So it's also worth taking this example and peeling the onion one layer back as well. Because you might ask yourself the question, if this guy, Bill Brady, was so conservative, how did he make it through the Republican primary that year? And the answer is that it was a very crowded field. Kirk Dillard from your neck of the woods was a strong candidate in that primary. There were others as well. And Brady wound up winning that primary, again, very narrowly with well under 25% of the vote. Had there been a ranked choice voting system in that primary, the outcome, again, very well might have been quite different, might have been more reflective, not just of a candidate's ability to hold together a very, very passionate, narrow slice of the electorate, but to appeal across lines beyond just their own individual base. And the difference between those two examples, I think, is really telling here. And so let's just analyze those examples for a second. Whether it's the Bush v. Gore example or the Quinn v. Brady example, the partisan general election examples of a Democrat versus a Republican, even though they may well have had a different outcome with a ranked choice voting system, nonetheless, those were elections where, basically the overwhelming majority of voters voted for the Democrat or the Republican. And even though the winner won with less than 50% of the vote, they won with 45 or 47 or 48 or 49% of the vote. And it's just kind of a tiny handful of people who wound up not voting for the Democrat or the Republican. In the primary, where, for instance, in the Republican primary for governor in Illinois in 2010, Brady won with under 25% of the vote. No one was anywhere close to 50%. And you might ask why that is. And I think the answer to the question of why that is, of why primaries are often decided with 20 or 30% of the vote, whereas general elections are decided usually with, if not over 50, then in the high 40s% of the vote. The reason is that I think most people, whatever they believe, whoever they prefer, whatever their instinct of who they'd like to vote for is, most people recognize that in this country, in general elections, Democrats or Republicans are almost always going to win. And so if you actually agree more strongly with the Green Party or the Libertarian Party or any other kind of minor party you might imagine existing, and minor parties do exist and get votes even beyond the Libertarians and the Greens in various parts of this country. If really your views and your beliefs are that other party, I really agree with the Greens, I really agree with the Libertarians, you're given a pretty unpalatable choice when general elections roll around. You're given the choice of either show up and vote my conscience, knowing that my candidate's going to wind up with 6% of the vote on a good day anyway, and so they won't be elected, and I've shown up and done my civic duty, but really how much of a difference does casting that ballot make? That's one option. Or show up and hold my nose and vote for someone I really don't agree with that much against someone I do agree with much more, but it's tactical and it's the only way to make an impact. And because that's the choice, not a lot of people wind up voting for candidates besides Democrats and Republicans. And a lot of people who would like to vote for candidates besides Democrats and Republicans wind up turned off from the system and less engaged and less motivated to participate in our democracy at all. And so let's think, for example, let's go back to the presidential election in the year 2000, and the Green Party and the Democrats. Now, I'm not suggesting that Green Party voters should love Democrats or the Democratic Party voters should love Green candidates. There's important differences, and I respect those differences. But generally speaking, supporters of those two parties are much more aligned than they are aligned with Republicans. And in a world where elected officials and government leaders were incentivized to collaborate, it would not be that hard to envision a collaborative relationship between Green Party folks and Democratic Party folks. But what was the lesson that Democratic partisans learned coming out of the year 2000? What they learned is they better do everything they possibly can to knock Greens off the ballot, to crush and eviscerate the Green Party so that it doesn't take votes away from them come November. And again, I'm not picking on Democrats here. The Republicans have drawn the exact same conclusion when it comes to libertarians. And in fact, though both parties have drawn the kind of converse conclusions as well. The Democrats try to kind of prop up fake libertarian candidates, much as Republicans try to prop up fake Green Party candidates to kind of steal votes from one another's bases. This is not a situation that achieves what I would argue is the most important goal of a democracy, which I think is something that the League of Women Voters is deeply and profoundly committed to, which is having a system that maximizes participation, having a system where the most people's voices are likely to be heard and considered and incorporated into the decisions of our government. Here we have Democrats and Greens who, naturally speaking, ought to be collaborating, instead trying to demolish one another to kind of protect their turf. Not because we have a personality type in this country that's all about turf protection, but because we have an electoral system that rewards turf protectors and punishes those who know how to collaborate and know how to reach out. By contrast, if you have a ranked choice voting system, the Democratic candidate could say, hey, listen, I hope you like me. I hope you vote for me. But if you vote for the Green candidate, consider putting me down twice, putting me down for second place, because we know how to work together and we agree on a lot of things. And then a voter has that option and says, my voice is being welcomed by the vote counting system. And so it makes sense for me to participate. And in a system like that, what you'll see is these other parties, if the main two parties don't do a great job of truly representing the will of the overwhelming majority of the public, then over time, these other parties will grow. Right now, it's almost impossible for the Green or Libertarian Party to truly grow, because no matter how disappointed people are with Republicans and Democrats, it's very, very hard to do what most people assume will be throwing away their vote and vote for the Green or the Libertarian Party just in the hope that you're going to build them up for later and be a part of a multi-decade long-term plan. You feel like, hey, I want my vote to matter now, and that's not the way to make my vote matter now. But in a system where you have ranked choice voting, there's a much greater degree of fluidity, of growing of coalitions over time and shifting of coalitions over time. And I think the shifting of coalitions is a really important piece of this, because ultimately, when I look at our political system now and ask myself, what is not working well about it? I see such knee-jerk polarization where people have such clarity about who their enemies are that it makes collaboration and partnership very, very difficult. And a ranked choice voting system is one that really selects for the candidates who know how to build surprising coalitions when they're running for office. And those tend to be, of course, the candidates who know how to build surprising coalitions after they have been elected. So anyway, I say all this to say, right now, if you look at general elections, Republicans and Democrats are getting almost all the votes anyway. And so at this moment, partisan November general election ranked choice voting system just kind of would reallocate those few votes on the margin that are not cast for Ds and for Rs. And then over time would allow a very different system to come into being. Now in primaries, it's a whole different ballgame because there aren't parties. When the candidates running against each other aren't from different parties, they're all from the same party. And so you already have these situations where again, candidates are nominated not only without a majority of the vote, but sometimes without a third or even a quarter of the vote. And having run in a complicated primary, I can tell you it is much easier to make the ability to really motivate a specific base pay off on election day than it is to make the ability to work with everyone, the ability to be a lot of people's second choice, the ability to be someone who can collaborate with a lot of different folks. And so I think party primaries in this state would change instantly with a ranked choice voting system. I think that if you look at the way that kind of the machine, so to speak, has been able to maintain control, there's actually been federal lawsuits about the fact that Mike Madigan, every time he had an opponent in a Democratic primary who he thought was formidable, he would recruit 2 or 3 other people who had very similar names to that person to just put their name on the ballot to confuse the electorate. And once you've done that, once you've made your opponent seem like they're one of 3 opponents who are all kind of indistinguishable, then you don't need 51% of the vote anymore to win. You need 26% of the vote, let's say, or 34% of the vote. And so a system like the one we have now is one that I think allows those who are already in power mechanisms to maintain that grip of on power that don't rely on them actually appealing to a majority. It becomes possible to hold on to power while just appealing to a highly motivated minority. And that, I think, is part of what leads us to a situation where there's a lot of question about how much trust people really ought to have in government, because they feel like folks in control didn't get in control by actually appealing to the majority of my neighbors. They figured out a trick to appeal to a quarter of my neighbors, and yet they're still over there in, let's say, Springfield, making decisions on my behalf. The last thing I want to say, we've talked about general elections with Democrats running against Republicans, and we've talked about primaries. But the other example, and I think this is even in the title of this evening's discussion, and certainly the world that I'm living in right now as the mayor of Evanston, is in most of the state of Illinois, and there's plenty of exceptions, but in most of the state of Illinois, candidates for municipal office are not partisan. Now, candidates for county office are almost always partisan. Candidates for township office really vary. A lot of them are partisan, but some are not. But candidates for local office, for municipal, for mayors and village boards and city councils, not to mention park and library boards and school boards and community college boards and so forth. Most of those, with exceptions, but most of those across the state are non-partisan. And the way in which ranked choice voting plays out in nonpartisan elections is the exact same way that it plays out within a partisan primary. We've had elections here in Evanston where, there's 4 candidates running and somebody gets elected to the city council with 30% of the vote or 35% of the vote. That kind of phenomenon is, it's fine. It's a system we have and I respect it, but it doesn't guarantee that the person that you have put into public office has the ability to really work collaboratively with a majority of the community. And I think it's fair to say, looking around right now, that for a variety of reasons, not because of our electoral system, which has not changed, but for a variety of reasons, this is a remarkably polarized time in government. I think part of it is just the national tone kind of trickling down, and I think the way the rhetoric and approach that Donald Trump deployed had an effect on the way people talk to each other around this country, and I think ratcheted up the polarization. I think the pandemic has been, it's been a lot of things. It's been an absolute tragedy, and it's been an enormous challenge. But it's also forced people into isolation. And that forced isolation, particularly in an environment where social media is so prevalent, has left people out of practice interacting with those they disagree with. right? If you live on Facebook, Facebook's job is to sort you into a bubble full of people who agree with you passionately about the thing that you feel most strongly about, because that's the mode of communication that's likeliest to keep your eyeballs on the screen and keep on enabling them to rack up ad revenue. I have a lot of thoughts about that. I'm happy to share if people are interested, but the bottom line is it's very, very different than living in a pluralistic community where people disagree with one another about all kinds of things. And I think that the effect of social media on our discourse was really, really problematic, frankly, for years already. But then when the pandemic came around, what it did was it cut off all the in-person interaction that had been a partial antidote to that. Because if Facebook's job is to route you into a bubble where you're surrounded by people who feel just as angry about you as you about the thing you feel most intensely about, well, the checkout line at the grocery store just cannot pull that off. And pickup at your neighborhood elementary school probably doesn't pull that off either. And so all of these quotidian interactions of just life, where the course of living life puts you in rooms full of people where you can't predict what they're going to think about a variety of different issues, it gives you practice with a kind of civility and grace around those who either disagree with you strongly about things you're talking about right now, or simply may disagree with you about things that you were contemplating discussing. And I think that the pandemic essentially gave us a year or more of watching those muscles atrophy. And our ability, our skill, our practice at being civil and generous with those we may not agree with diminished. And it's left us in a situation where our politics are I think, angrier and frankly meaner than they were before. And this was a very long sort of aside, but I went into that in detail on purpose. And sorry if it was too much, but I went there on purpose because it really does animate my interest in finding reforms to our system of governance that are themselves tools to bring us together, that themselves force us to find ways to bridge those gaps. And again, I'm a progressive Democrat with, I'm not a kumbaya person at all. I've got strong views and I disagree strongly with people, and I love to argue about that stuff. But I think there's a difference between arguing against someone who you believe to be your sworn enemy versus arguing against someone who you disagree with really strongly, but you know that you could be in coalition with them later. And a ranked choice voting system is one where almost anybody could be in coalition with you later. And I think it changes the incentives on how we interact with one another. And so, ultimately the impact of a ranked choice voting system on a general election is different than that on a partisan primary, is different than that on a nonpartisan election. But I think in all cases, it's a tool to move toward having leaders and policies that bring together enough of our population to truly build the kind of knit together society that I think we really hunger for right now and don't see as much of as we would like. And so that's why I think this is a really important thing. When I kicked off by describing how a ranked choice voting system works, you sort of sound almost like you're just talking about some kind of weird like computer science problem, some technical thing. But ultimately it's about building a system that gives us the connection and the capacity for collaboration that makes the society work. And I think the stakes are pretty high when we talk about those things. And that's why I'm so glad to have a chance to be with you tonight. So with that, I think I've gone on for more than long enough, and happy to hand it back to Pam for questions and discussion.
Well, thank you very much, Mayor Biss. We have some questions that were sent in ahead and a few that are in the chat or in the Q&A, I should say, tonight. The first question, bear with me, it's a long explanation from Gregory. The system presumes that second choice picks of the least popular candidates should have equal weight with everyone's first choice in the initial absence of majority. What is the evidence that preferences between first and second choices are fairly close as opposed to a sharp drop off in the appeal of the second place choice? Also, how often do voters fail to rank candidates so that if their preferred first choice does not initially win a majority, those voters will have lost any role in picking the winner, thus showing ranked choice role in identifying the true majoritarian choice may be tenuous, if not spurious. I think Greg has a point of view here that he's sharing. Ranked choice voting seems a search for a process solution for the social problem of a lack of popular consensus. So if you got all of that, Dan, I'll let you give a whack at it.
Yeah, I think for the question, I think it's a very fair question, Gregory. And I'm gonna, it was long and a little complex. I'm gonna, with your indulgence, Pam, restate a little bit of it.
Okay.
You know, what Gregory is saying is, you know, I might, you know, go to vote and know for sure that I'm really there to vote for candidate A. You know, I mean, let's pick an example. Let's go back to 2000. I voted for Al Gore in 2000. And so there I am. And all I've really prepared for is I'm there to vote for Al Gore. And I mark off Al Gore as my number one. And then I don't really know who my second choice is. I haven't thought about it very hard. I don't really care that much, but you know, I have the opportunity to mark somebody. So I just kind of pick somebody at random, or I pick a distant second choice who is basically not much preferred to my third choice, but I just check something and kind of walk out of the room. And then my first choice turns out not, you know, coming in last place. So my vote gets reallocated, and that like flippant, I didn't think about it very hard, second choice in the second round of counting counts as much as someone's first choice vote. And Gregory says, does that seem fair? Well, no, it does not. No, it does not. It does not seem fair. And that is absolutely a thing that would happen under ranked choice voting. The problem is that is just how elections are, right? And it happens with regular voting as well. If and by the way, I think we've all here in good Illinois, where there's so many offices to vote for, I think we've all probably shown up to the voting booth kind of undecided for some offices. If you haven't, God love you, but I have. I've shown up for some judicial races, or you know, certain, you know, community college board races. I just didn't really decide, and I show up and I don't tell anyone this, but I vote almost at random. You know, or maybe I think that was the candidate for judge who I was impressed with. I'm not 100% sure, but that name rings a bell. And I cast votes like that. And that vote counts as much as my vote for Joe Biden over Donald Trump, which I would have, you know, crawled over broken glass and walked through fire and on hot coals to vote for Joe Biden over Donald Trump. So a voting system, whether it's a ranked choice voting system or a first past the post system, which is what we call our system, or any number of other systems, they're all imperfect. They're all some effort to build a counting system that translates what the public wants into what we're going to do. And there's actually a guy called Ken Arrow won a Nobel Prize in economics for essentially proving that any system you build is going to be deeply flawed. That there's whatever system you build, you can cook up a hypothetical election where it's going to give you kind of a gobbledygook outcome. And the guy really won a Nobel Prize for that. It's really fascinating work that he did. So I'm not here to tell you that ranked choice voting is perfect. And I'm also not here to tell you that we ought to just be able to reach consensus on everything. I think that's a very naive hope. But I am here to tell you that the system, the behavior of candidates and the behavior of elected officials is highly attuned to the system that we have. And the system that we have really de-emphasizes the ability to collaborate. And a ranked choice voting system does emphasize the ability to collaborate. So here's a concrete thing you can test. In a ranked choice voting system, I don't just want to be as many people's first choice as possible. I also want to be as many people's second choice as possible. And if I'm running and Pam is running, and I want to be the second choice of the folks who are voting for Pam, it's probably not in my interest to run a harshly negative campaign against Pam, because if I do that, her voters aren't going to like me, and they're not going to mark me down second. And so you might ask yourself, do places with ranked choice voting have less negative campaigns than places that don't have ranked choice voting? And the data that I've seen suggests that yes, they do. That having a ranked choice voting system actually, practically speaking, does discourage candidates from running harshly negative campaigns, because it's not in their best interest as often. And so I'm not saying it's a magic trick, and I'm not saying it's always perfect. I'm not saying it even always gives you the right outcome. But I am saying that it's a system that I think more often gives you the right outcome. And I think it's an incentive that pushes the candidates, and then after they win, the elected officials, to behave in a more collaborative way. And I do think that's something worth selecting for.
Thank you. Jean asks, what do you think of using ranked choice voting with nonpartisan primaries with the top voter getters going on to the general election, no matter what party or affiliation they have?
Yeah, so this is a system they have, and they've had it for some version of it in Louisiana, and also I think in California now more recently, where there's a couple ways to do it. One is just the primaries are nonpartisan. There's not really primaries at all. You have an election with as many candidates as want to run, and then the top 2 or 3 or 4 advance to like the runoff stage, essentially. Another way of doing it, which is what they do definitely in California, and I think Louisiana too, is you run on a party line, but there might be like 3 Democrats and 4 Republicans, and they're all jumbled up in a single primary. And then the 2 top vote getters move on to the general election. In fact, there was I can't remember the details, but back when Governor Newsom was running for the first time, which I guess, gosh, must have been 2018, I guess. I forget when, maybe 2016, I don't know. Whenever Gavin Newsom was running for the first time, there was the possibility that there would be 2 Democrats in the runoff, and it was sort of clear he was going to make it to the runoff, but he actually intervened to get the preferred opponent in the runoff to sort of make it easier for him. So I guess I would say that based on what I've seen out of those systems, I think the changes that have been made in California around their redistricting system and also around their voting system have been an improvement. I think I will say something that's very unpopular, but I mean it. I actually think political parties are good. I know it's very fashionable to say that political parties are bad. I think political parties are really useful for the simple reason that I think that we need to be vigilant in asking our voters to do a realistic amount of homework. And if there are political parties, they make that homework way easier. I will tell you bluntly, I don't need to do any homework to figure out who I'm voting for Congress. I'm voting for the Democrat. Not because I'm mindless or unthoughtful, but because I know enough about the 2 parties and what they stand for that even if there's an unusual Republican and an unusual Democrat, I'm going to vote for the Democrat for Congress to help advance the agenda that the Democratic Party is trying to advance. And it makes the likelihood of me being kind of hoodwinked or bamboozled by a campaign much lower, because the parties are these established entities that provide a usual shorthand. Frankly, it's much harder to vote in local elections. Even for me, I'm the mayor right now. I'm the actual mayor, and I still find it harder to figure out who to vote for in local elections than I do in partisan elections, because, you know, every person for themselves, they all say kind of similar things. And it's quite tricky to do enough homework to really know confidently, no, even though these 3 candidates all say relatively similar things, this one ultimately is the right choice over these other 2 for reasons X, Y, and Z. So I think having parties makes the ask we are delivering, the ask we are making of our voters more realistic and more appropriate. So I think purely nonpartisan, an initial election followed by a runoff with no parties at all, I think is not what I would advocate. But I think, and I do have a little bit of hesitation about sort of jumbling them all up into a single field, because I know that it can allow sort of tactical voting and kind of manipulation on the part of well-funded candidates can really be, there can be an awful lot of that. But again, watching the system play out in California does seem to have been an improvement. And so I'm certainly open-minded to it.
Great. I know you talked a little bit about the fragmentation before, but Lincoln asks, is it possible that this system will fragment our politics and create the same type of political confusion that you see in European countries?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, and this goes on some level back to Gregory's point, there's no perfect system at all. And, you know, I mean, those of you who've like watched the Israeli parliament try to function, not only during the 4 consecutive elections where Netanyahu sort of almost lost, but didn't quite until the 4th one, but even just for decades before that, it's not as though the grass is always greener on the other side of the fence. I think that you need to figure out how to strike a balance between, on the one hand, having a robust way for minority views to be heard, right? So the current system we have in America, if you agree with the Greens or the Libertarians, you're kind of locked out of participating at all. And I think we're too far on that end of the spectrum. The opposite problem is when every voice gets heard so well that you can't make progress. You can't even build a functioning governing coalition, or you can't build a governing coalition without parties that have truly reprehensible views, let's say, and so I think you've got to be careful on both sides, and I think there are certainly examples in Europe that demonstrate that it's possible to go way too far in the other direction. I think having just a ranked choice voting system would be very unlikely to create that outcome. Certainly it wouldn't for a long period of time, right? To get to a place where you had a kind of multi-party system where neither Democrats nor Republicans were ever had a majority, and they had to build a coalition with a third party to govern. We're pretty far from there. But I guess I'll just say, I don't think it's a coincidence that our system is as exclusive of minority voices as it is, especially compared with many, certainly many parliamentary systems, and in general, most other kind of mature democracies. And we have such low voter turnout. I think those facts are correlated. I mean, that's a difficult thing to prove, obviously, but to me, it doesn't feel like a coincidence that, first of all, we're this giant country, right? We're one of the very most populous democracies in the world. Not quite the most, but the most populous democracy in the world. Certainly has a complex system with a lot of parties. And in this giant country of 1/3 of a billion people, we only have 2 parties that are really represented in a meaningful way at the federal level. And so each one is supposed to be representing, 160 million people. I think it's very, very difficult to ask a single political party to represent 160 million people in a country as large and diverse and complicated as this one very effectively. And so we wind up in a situation where a lot of people just look at the options, they say, there's nothing for me there. Then they walk away, and then we have lower voter turnout. And I think that really hurts us in a lot of respects. So anyway, I take the point, I take the premise of the question seriously. I think there's a way, it is possible to fail in that way, but I think we've got to move the needle pretty meaningfully in that direction.
Okay, we have a series of questions, Dan, that are more procedural in nature. Jean mentions that currently this can only be done if home rule communities approved it by referendum. So what are the prospects for more general usage, considering that only about 50% of election authorities have voting machines that could even accommodate ranked choice voting?
Well, so you named two different problems, right? So one is it technically possible? And one is, how hard is it to get there? Yeah, look, there's 102 counties in Illinois, and some of them do not have the size, budget, and sophistication of Cook and DuPage counties. I don't think that's a problem we should try to solve right now, quite frankly. Right? I think there's no ranked choice voting occurring in Illinois right now. I could be wrong about that, but I'm not aware of any. And I think the first step is in places that are interested and are in, large sophisticated counties or non-county election authorities like Chicago, but places that are in, that have large, sophisticated, well-funded election authorities that certainly could handle this type of system, to try it. I think there's an effort underway in Evanston to put a referendum on the ballot to create a ranked choice voting system here. I strongly support that. I think we've got a decent chance of making that happen. And to me, we don't need to figure out how to do ranked choice voting in Cairo in Alexander County tomorrow. I think we should do ranked choice voting in places where the local residents believe it's the right thing to do, where the election authority has the capacity to do it effectively and well, and then just watch the outcome and see if it has the outcome of bringing people together and improving governance in those communities, and then go from there. So I don't, I think, frankly, making sure that even the more sophisticated election authorities are prepared to do it well is really important. New York City had ranked choice voting in this most recent election, and it went fine ultimately, but there was sort of a kind of hold your breath moment where it looked like their board of elections might be messing it up. And, New York City is far more populous than any county in Illinois, and it's got an absolutely giant budget. And so making sure that if it is tried anywhere, it's done properly is the most important thing. And then, yeah, I think, for home rule communities, it has to be done by referendum, and for other communities, it can't be done at all. I think that's fine. Let's run a referendum. Let's make sure that the people actually know what they're getting into and want it, and then do it. And I think, if we're being honest, imposing ranked choice voting for the state legislators who have to pass laws enabling ranked choice voting might be hard. That may not be what they want. It's always easier to get elected officials to reform somebody else's election system than their own. But I bet if ranked choice voting takes off and does well and people really like it, it would not be that hard to pass a law in Springfield enabling non-home rule communities or non-home rule local governments to enact their own system. So, to me, all of the challenges are kind of for step 4 and 5. Steps 1, 2, and 3 are pick a few places where it could absolutely be done from a home rule perspective and a technical perspective, and do it there and do it well. And really ask yourself the honest and tough questions about whether it's working and how much people like it, and then figure out how to expand it.
Well, Dan, you raised Tracy wrote in a question ahead of time, and you raised a question about, kind of the holding the breath in New York for that mayoral ranked choice primary. She just wanted to know, could ranked choice voting lead to, a greater risk of vote manipulation, for example, digital manipulation of like the second, third choice, when you go all the way down the list with as many candidates as they had in New York, for example?
Yeah, I don't think so. I mean, I think that the danger of cyber attacks on election systems is terrifying, but I feel deeply terrified about it in non-ranked choice voting systems. I don't think it's I don't think there's really a significant difference there. One of the things that was tricky in New York was just, the ranked choice voting process is you count the votes and then you cross off whoever came in last, and you redistribute some votes, and then you look at who came in last again in that new count, and then you cross that person off, and there's all these steps. And the thing that was tricky in New York was you can't start that process until you've really counted everything, right? In a normal election, 9 times out of 10 by midnight, you know who's won, not because you've counted all the votes and you've counted all the absentee votes, but because it's just not close enough to matter. But in this situation, in a ranked choice voting situation, you really need to know among the fringe candidates who came in very last. And so you can't know that for sure because they maybe only got a tiny handful of votes anyway. So they weren't able to do any of the math stuff until a week later, which made it seem like there was something fishy going on. But it wasn't. It was just the system working the way the system will inevitably work in a pandemic when lots of people are voting by mail. And so I think there's this additional challenge of how do you educate people about what we need to expect of it and what we can't expect of it, so they're not surprised at the last minute by, hold on, I went to the polls yesterday and I still have no idea who won the election.
Right. Lincoln asked a couple of questions that are kind of, again, procedural. He said, if a candidate gets more than 50% of the vote, will there be consideration of secondary choices?
No. So the whole point of the system is to get a winner with over 50%.
Okay.
If you get that on the first round, then there's actually no difference between a ranked choice voting system and the system we're used to.
Sure. And then he also asks, what about the implications for the electoral college?
Yeah, so it's interesting. So Maine has enacted a ranked choice voting system, and they elected a different member of Congress from the 2nd district of Maine. So Maine is like, there's like the Portland district and the other district. And the Portland district is solidly Democratic. The other district is kind of a swing district. The guy who won that district actually would not have won in the traditional system. He had like 48% of the vote and lost to the guy who had like 49% of the vote in the first tally, and then wound up winning in the second tally. And so I believe that Maine utilizes that ranked choice voting system for its electoral college votes for president as well. And as you may know, different states do different things with the electoral college. So Nebraska allocates its electoral votes by congressional district, as does Maine. No other state does. So a state would be within its rights, I'm pretty confident, to establish a ranked choice voting system for the way they determine their presidential election. I think states that are looking at ranked choice voting on the federal level do cover presidential elections. And I don't personally have that strong an opinion about it, but I don't see any reason not to do it. I think the arguments for it, I think, are as persuasive for a presidential campaign as for a different office.
I see that our time is running short, but Bob and Donna both had similar questions for you, and this may be a whole other evening conversation. But both of the questions seem to relate to this idea that maybe the primaries are the problem, and that So, what about this notion that we get rid of primaries, or nonpartisan open primaries? So what are some of your thoughts about that?
Yeah, I mean, I'll be the first to admit that the partisan open primaries are, from a sort of theoretical perspective, kind of weird, right? A party is supposed to be a private organization, and so the way it's done in most countries is the party itself, in a truly internal process of some kind, picks who their candidates are, who their leaders are, and so on and so forth. An open partisan primary says, yeah, the Democrats decide who the Democratic nominee is, but the definition of Democrat is who woke up that day, went to the polls, and checked the Democrat box when they signed in. So there's something a little goofy about that, I'll be the first to admit. I think that a ranked choice voting system in primaries would make a really big difference, frankly, because I do think that a lot of people who are pretty much aligned with one party or another, right? So like, it's very fashionable to call yourself independent and say that you vote the person, not the party, but most people who say that still actually vote for the same party 90 or 95 or more % of the time in general elections. But they may say that because they don't really feel like a party line person. They don't necessarily agree with all the party's positions, but they just sort of clearly prefer this party to that party. And I think people like that, of whom there are lots, would be likelier to feel there was something to vote for in a primary with ranked choice voting. And, as I said earlier, I actually think parties are really useful. Again, as unfashionable a position as that as that is these days. And so I think if you're going to have parties, which I think you should, you have to have some mechanism for figuring out who leads the parties and figuring out who kind of sets the party's agenda. And I think it's good for that. I think it's functionally good for that to be open. So let me give you an example. Mike Madigan was the chair of the Democratic Party of Illinois until, a year ago, I guess. And most people, even people who had read in the paper that Madigan was the chair of the party, they didn't know why. And the reason for why is that he was selected by the State Central Committee, which is 36 people who are elected in highly obscure elections. So here, the person who's the leader of the whole party is chosen in this kind of opaque, goofy way that your typical person who just lives in Illinois and believes in most of what the Democratic Party believes and didn't really feel like they had any input into it. And the outcome of that was that the party was sort of unmoored from the people it's supposed to serve. So all of that's a long meandering way of saying, I get the concern about our system. I don't think our system is super great, but I think it's important that we have parties, and I think the way that we determine who leads the parties should be open and inclusive, rather than narrow and opaque. And so ultimately some kind of primary election process, I think, is the right way to handle it.
Great. Well, I had a question here that I think I'm going to let another participant answer because someone asked, is there a place where ranked choice voting is working well? And Nancy has put a comment in the Q&A that said she lived in Minneapolis, St. Paul a few years ago, and ranked choice voting arrived there. And while it seemed complicated at first, after a little thinking about it, it fell into place and made a lot of sense. It seems like places that have started using this are doing just fine. So I think that's probably a great segue. Although I also had a question, maybe Dan, you can finish with this one, wanting to know what the future of ranked choice voting is in Evanston, if you think it'll be coming to Evanston.
Yeah, and I just couldn't agree more with that, the previous comment. Nancy, it's not happening all over the place, but it's happening in plenty of places. I indicated New York just shifted to it, and Maine shifted to it recently, and there are other examples as well. And it doesn't seem like people are walking away from it. It seems like it does eventually catch on in places that try it. So right now, there's a group of advocates who I support and work with, who are working with our city council to try to gain support to put a ranked choice voting referendum on the ballot. I've learned as mayor never to make promises on behalf of what city council will or will not do, but I will say that I would say not certain, but optimistic that we'll be able to get that done. And then it'll be a referendum on the ballot, and the voters of Evanston would have to approve it. And I think that referendum would have a pretty good chance, because I don't think there's going to be somebody saying loudly, this is a terrible idea. I think, people like myself and others will explain why we think it's worth trying. And I think the electorate of Evanston is definitely interested in looking for better ways to help us govern ourselves. And my guess is, and hold me to this in a year or two, but my guess is that we'd be likely to be successful in a referendum.
Great. Well, Daniel, thank you so much. And thanks for being patient with us running overtime, but I wanted to try to get to as many of the questions as we could. And I think I got to the vast majority of them.
I think we ran overtime because your speaker did not know how to give concise answers to those excellent questions.
I think there was a lot of good information here tonight, and we had a lot of engaged participation, and that's always what we're looking for. So I on behalf of the league, I want to thank you very much. And I want to turn our program now over to Judy Beaver, the president of the Wheaton League.
Thank you, Pam. And thank you so much, Mayor Biss. You've helped us to understand more about ranked choice voting, and we're grateful you shared your evening with us. And as always, thank you to Cantini and the League of Women Voters of Central Kane County, and to you, the audience, for your participation. We truly appreciate your engagement. So please join us. Let me just get this slide full screen here. Please join us next week for 2 programs. One is our living room conversations. It's a small group discussion about topics of mutual interest, and everyone shares their perspectives. This month's topic is cancel culture on Monday, the 14th at 7 p.m. And then on Thursday, March 17th at 7 p.m., our local civic awareness program is DuPage County Clerk Jean Kasmerick will present Election 2022, What You Need to Know. So DuPage County voters will learn about our new voting equipment, changes in voting opportunities due to legislation passed by the Illinois General Assembly, and how redistricting will affect your representation in the county, state, and congressional elected offices. So please register on our website. The program is free, as all our programs are, and open to the public, and a Zoom link will be sent 24 hours before the event to those who have registered. And please join us in April on the 14th for our civic awareness program, where Edith Macra and Tim Milburn will be presenting the climate action plan for the Chicago region. Please visit our website to see all of our programs, and we have for Women's History Month as well. So good night, everyone. We'll see you next week. Thank you very much.